Gary Price, introduce our next guest.
This old feller here and I go back to Bean Blossom 1970. Do you remember where we were when we met? Whose camp we were?
Calvin Robbins, probably.
No, it was actually was Pat Hicks.
Okay,
Jack's
just
mom and dad.
about 4 or 5 campers away.
Yeah. And
Now, when you go back, I'm going to interject. When you go back that number of years, this is Doug Hutchens, okay? And we're going to have Doug tell a bit of his history. And most of us are at least aware of the history that Doug has had in the world of bluegrass music, with his time with Bill Monroes, his time with Gibson, but we're going to touch on that. But the ironic part of this, as we're sitting here talking, is that I'm sitting here with a friend, Roger Bannister, and all 4 of us were at Bean Blossom in 1970. You had just graduated from high school.
Yep.
And Roger and I both graduated from high school in 1970 also. Now, Gary's a lot older than us, so he's kind of our fatherly figure.
I was old when dirt was invented.
That's it. My question for you, Doug, how did you get started playing? What were the influences in the area that you first?
Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs, twice a week.
Radio show in the morning?
No, TV.
Okay.
They would play. They would do the show in Nashville. They would put it on the bus because there was no UPS back in those days. They would do what they call bicycling it around. They'd put it on the bus. It would go from city to city. It went into Winston-Salem on Saturday night, and it was in Roanoke on Monday.
So you grew up in Roanoke?
No, I grew up in a little place called Spencer, Virginia. If you draw a line
Spencer.
between Winston-Salem and Roanoke, I live about 600 yards from the border.
Mm-hmm.
If the wind's blowing real good, you can throw a tumbleweed and it'll go into.
Yeah, where you're living right now, okay, is pretty exactly where you grew up.
Living back on the family farm.
Yeah.
Where I grew up there.
Yes.
But
now, what year would it have been that you were receiving those shows?
The earliest I can remember is back about 63.
Okay.
And the reason I can put something with that is because I can remember when John Kennedy was killed.
Right.
And because they didn't do the Flatt and Scruggs show on that Saturday night.
Yeah, you were probably in the 3rd grade.
Probably so, yeah, somewhere along there.
Yeah, we all remember where we were when that happened.
Yep. The neat thing, I recently picked up an old TV guide from the next January that did a kind of a recap of the week of the assassination.
Yes.
And there was a thing of the Ford show, Ernie Ford show.
Tennessee Ernie Ford.
Guest Bill Monroes.
Really?
AndVe never seen that. Can't find anybody who would have been playing with him at that time.
Right.
Bill Keith was with him and Dale McCurry.
Dale McCurry.
And they were in the car coming, I think, from Florida to New York, or either from New York going to Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And drove all day and didn't know about it or whatever.
Right.
There.
Yeah,
anyway, they were in the car at that time.
Right.
But also, I was watching Don Reno and Red Smile every morning on TV.
Right.
You know,
because they were stationed down in that area.
In a WDBJ in Roanoke.
Now, as you heard them, then did that pique your interest in starting to learn to play the banjo or the bass or the guitar, or what was the first?
Banjo. Well, I had a couple of uncles that several years before had learned to play, and Uncle John was a pretty good guitar player, played a little mandolin. Uncle Bruce, he could kind of play around on, the different things.
Now, did your mother and father play?
Mom played some, but Dad, he could play the radio.
Okay.
He wasn't a person that never loved music any better.
Right.
But Dad just never picked up an instrument.
Now, brothers and sisters?
I got 2 sisters. Neither one of those ever played anything.
Okay.
But I got and of course, when the Beatles came out, I can remember when they went on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I got that stuff in my head for a long, long time, and still enjoy it.
Sure.
But it was Christmas 1963 when I got my first banjo.
Okay.
Santa Claus did well.
Mm-hmm.
And
Now, did you self-teach, or
Yeah.
did you get
there
some
was-
instructions
there was
along the way?
virtually, well, it's not, Sonny Osborne, his Bluegrass banjo thing on Mel Bay came out a year or two later. But I basically got out of the shade tree and run mom and dad and cats and dogs away from home. The neighbors up and down the road on a good clear day when it would carry, they was all wondering what in the world was going on up
Did
there.
you wear out a few records along the way too?
Didn't have a record player.
Really?
It was probably another 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
I was playing. They started a round and square dance, maybe a mile and so from the house, and Clarence Hall, her buddy, where it comes
Yes.
to these, his dad played banjo down there, and I'd go down every Saturday night and just sit and just stare at what he was doing. Now Arthur Hall could Scruggs. He could Scruggs Reno.
Mm-hmm.
His dad was one of the best banjo players in our part of the country, period. I could hear Earl Scruggs play something. I never will forget the first time I ever heard Cumberland Gap. I thought, man, that is a neat tune. And then I realized I'm going to hear it again on Monday night.
Mm-hmm.
But then I went on down to the dance and I asked Arthur to play it. Doggone if he didn't play it, and he had the same attack, the same emphasis, the same fire
Right.
as Earl Scruggs did.
Now, as you were moving through the '60s and starting to learn to play the banjo, what led you to become involved with Bill Monroe and work your way all the way to Bean Blossom in 1970?
Well, when I got driver's license, I never was part of a band as such. There was 2 or 3 guys we played together for a little while there, but I was kind of always the lone wolf, and I'd go to fiddlers conventions. There's always somebody that doesn't have their banjo player didn't show up.
Right.
And so I would just kind of fall in, play with this one, play with that one, play with the old time fiddlers where, cut the corner on you at the end of the line and stuff like that. So you had to anticipate what was coming. But I went for from the time I got to the point I could drive and go out to a fiddlers convention until, the summer of '70, I would go to, and you could go from the 2 weeks before Easter at Low Gap, North Carolina. The next week was King. The next week was Union Grove. And it would go all the way to usually the second week in November.
Right.
They'd finish up at Flat Rock, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Go every Saturday, and sometimes Friday and Saturday.
Now, how did you come to meet Bill Monroe, and in what year?
Calvin Robbins. Well, I met him first. Carlton Haney did a package show up at the old American Theater in Roanoke.
Okay.
Bill Anderson, typical Nashville package show. He had Bill Monroe on it.
Mm-hmm.
Never seen him in person. This was right before Kenny Baker came back, so Benny Williams was playing fiddle,
Right.
Vic Jordan, Roland White, and James was playing bass. Went up there and, it was a typical theater, and went in, and of course I've always been one of these wanderers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wander around. Next thing I knew, I'm down in the dressing rooms down in the bottom. There's a little dressing room, not much more than from here over to the wall, just a very small one. And I hear this music in there, and it was Roland and Bill and Vic
Mm-hmm.
in there. They just tearing it up. And I just kind of slipped in. Back in them days, I was a lot thinner than I could slip in. Now you have to push the doorway a lot further. But I would sit there, and I stood in there and listened to them for a good long while. That was at the time Benny Williams had been working on the bus that day and got his hand caught in his right hand caught in the fan on the bus. So his hand was bandaged up like,
Wow, yeah.
something fierce.
Right.
But playing the fiddle, it was just the sweetest thing
Magic.
I've ever heard.
It was magic.
That would have been along in probably September of maybe '68.
Mm-hmm.
They were of course, Red Smiley was still on TV at that point in time.
Right.
He and Don had split up in November of '64, and then David Deese took Don's place.
Right.
They were still on TV, and they started advertising this festival down at the Lake Norman Music Hall in Terrell, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dad and I went down there, and we slept in the back of the car, or in the car. I slept in the back, and Dad slept in the front for 3 nights. And again, seeing Monroe there, and that was, I kind of got acquainted that way.
Right.
But at that same festival, the next year, Butch Robbins has just gone into service,
Mhm.
or was getting ready to go into service, hadn't quite gone yet. But Calvin, his dad, asked me if I'd like to go to Bean Blossom with him next year.
Right.
Now, a couple of years before, I'd actually written the Bean County, or the Brown County Chamber of Commerce, which I found out didn't exist. But somebody up there was nice enough to send me a letter back. I asked them if there's any rail or bus transportation into Bean
Nashville.
Blossom.
Right, into
And
Nashville.
I didn't know
Bean
where
Blossom.
Nashville, Indiana was. You know, I'd hear Bill talking about, 35 miles south of Indianapolis.
Right.
But I wrote them, and I got a real nice letter from somebody back there, and there was no rail or bus or anything coming in there. And so somehow it came up in the conversation. Calvin was a super good guitar player, and always would be jam sessions around his campsite. And he asked me, said, how would you like to go to Bean Blossom with me next year? I said, well, it'd be great.
In Calvin's background, he was an electrician.
He was.
Okay.
He taught
And
electricity.
and Calvin Robbins is Butch Robbins' father.
Yep.
Okay. And he would come up to Bean Blossom and supply his time and efforts to improve the electrical service.
We hung a lot of lines for lights. We helped Spurs pull his wire through the trees.
Silver
for the
Spurs,
tree
Ragsdale. Right.
Little Silver Spurs, Ragsdale.
So that was really your entree into getting to know Bill better?
Well, what happened there is I went up with Calvin. We went about 10 days before the festival began. And we got there, and we just got up in the morning. Calvin knew where things was at. We just started work.
Right.
And of course, back in them days, Bill then would go out and play the weekends, and then come back in on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, whatever, and spend 2 or 3 days at Bean Blossom there, and then they'd go back out and work the weekend again. So after a day or so, I was over working with Calvin, was doing this and doing that. And Bill come over and says, "Who hired you?" I said, "Well, nobody." And he says, "Well, who's going to pay you?" I said, "Well, don't guess there's going to be any pay in it." And so nothing was said. Every night we would get together and pick.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's kind of a thing where we just kind of naturally moved into knowing each other a little bit.
Right.
And then at the end of the festival there, getting ready to leave, Bill was calling everybody on the bus to straighten up with them. But before the end of the festival there, I'd worked the gate and I'd done everything else, just like you just kind of naturally do what needs to be done. And Bill called me on the bus and said, "Well, how much do I owe you?" I said, "Well, you don't owe me anything." To me, it was just a joy to be able to be around the man.
As an 18-year-old
Yeah.
who's away from home and living in that environment.
It was like, and we used to run a little country store. And a lot of the old timers, and especially in the fall and winter, what did they do when the crops was already in? They'd come to the little country store, sit around the pot-bellied stove, play checkers. And Bill and Bertha and Birch were like kin folks to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was just
Natural.
It was totally natural.
Yeah, totally natural.
And so he paid me $200 or $300 for doing this and doing that. And then every time I was at a show after that, he'd always ask me to come up and play a tune on stage.
Mm-hmm.
So that year, that would have been in '70, at Myrtle Beach in the fall. He did something he'd never done before. Before, in a weekend, he'd asked me to come up and play once. But he made a point to catch me each day of the 3 days I was there and asked me to come up and play a tune. So I played 3 shows, or 3 tunes that weekend.
Right.
I got ready to leave. I went by, tell him, I was heading back to Kentucky. And he said, "Well, how would you like to work with me next summer?" I said, "Well, what will I be doing?" He said, "Well, I don't know, but I'll guarantee you a job." And said, "In the spring, just when you call me, come down to the opera and go to the opera with me, we'll figure it out." So it was along in March. R.C. Harris from over in Mooresville, North Carolina, was playing banjo. Rudy Arbor left, and Earl Sneed worked a few dates, and Bobby Thompson had done some recording. But then R.C. started playing banjo, but he was still living in Mooresville. On the Friday night that I got there, I went over to the Ryman, and never had been there before, never been to Nashville, nothing else. Of course, I get there at 2:30 in the day. and look around. And about 5, they opened up the doors. I thought, well, now it's only about $3.75. I'm going in there and see what it is. So I paid my money and went on in, and I've never so disappointed in my life. Our old country store floor was better than the Ryman's floor. It was oiled down looked like burnt cylinder oil, and you walk around in the back there, and it would creak, 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 creak. First time I went up into the balcony, I mean, it's like shriek, 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 shriek. Yeah. I get up in the balcony, I'm still looking around. All of a sudden, Bill had told me to meet him backstage at 6:30. I had lost track of time, and I saw Bill walking across the back of the stage. I thought, oh my goodness, I missed him. Yeah. So I go down and run around, and of course I meet the guard back there. And I said, well, I'm supposed to meet Bill Monroe here. He said, you wait right here. So he goes and gone a few minutes. Bill comes and said, yeah, this man's with me. So go on in, find out that RC is snowed in North Carolina. Not going to make it there. And I thought,
So that's your starting point.
Well, Joe Stewart was playing bass, and Kitty was playing fiddle, and James was still playing guitar. And Joe said, well, let's go and get you straight with in here, we'll sign you up with your union card. I said, I don't have a union card. He said, well, you can't work the Opry without being a member of the union. So Pete Sayers, who was over here from England, who was kind of an international troubadour, he also played banjo some. So he ended up playing banjo with Bill that night. And then RC got in the next day.
Right.
We talked with Bill. He's told me, well, when I got it through with school at Berea, to go on to Bean Blossom and work with Bertha and Birch. And we'd work it from there.
Right.
So when I got out of school, I went home for a day or so and then took off to Bean Blossom, 611 miles from my driveway to the driveway up there.
Yep.
And pulled in and slept in the little bedroom that's our office.
That was at the front end of the...
It's right beside the ticket booth
absolutely.
there.
Yeah.
Took me a sleeping bag. And I mean, I didn't realize, I didn't go into the barn part. I thought, well, I ain't supposed to be in there. But it wasn't nothing held but an old piece of wire. And so the first 3 or 4 days, I went down and got me some Mountain Dews and got me a loaf of bread and some cheese. And that's what I eat. I guess it was about 2 days until Birch came over. Birch and Bertha, they'd always come together. He'd come to clean out the seats and do this and do that in there. And they said, are you just eating that? And I said, well, yeah. They said, well, get you whatever you want. Put it in the refrigerator in here. And so then after that, Bertha would always make sure that she brought me breakfast and lunch every day.
Yeah.
And then Birch would slip me a little money and said, here, just go on down to, at that time I think it was called the Lavender House, the little restaurant down below.
Yeah, Hap's Lavender House.
And so, yeah.
In that time frame, Doug, as you were getting to know Monroe and building that relationship, how did you transition into your involvement with the Gibson Banjo Company? Because I think most people in the world of bluegrass music and in banjo, as we know it, really associate you with the movement back in the mid-1980s with Earl and the starting of the Earl Scruggs model banjo, and then your evolution with Gibson in the mid-1980s. How do you catalyze that relationship with Gibson?
With going to Bean Blossom there, I met people like Harry Sparks, met this critter here. I mean, and the thing of it was, there was no secrets. You asked one of them a question, and I mean, they would explain whatever. I mean, you know, it wasn't that way with the few people who did a little bit of instrument work around home. It's like, how do you cut that stuff out in there? I asked C.E. Ward one time, how do you cut that out? What kind of knife? He said, no, you don't use no knife. But he didn't bother to tell me anything about a jeweler's saw.
Right.
But, what's his name? Jim Faulkner. I met him at Bean Blossom.
Yeah, out of Indianapolis.
Reuben String Instrument Repair, and he was friends with Earl.
Right.
Matter of fact, he was the one that refinished Earl's and put the the third neck
Yeah.
in it there.
Yeah.
And, you know, Earl said when he brought it back to it, I don't know whether Jim did it consciously or whether he just wanted to kind of put his spin on the banjo history. He refinished the resonator.
That's where it become honey yellow, if you would.
Honey tone, or
Yeah.
some people call it
Right.
baby puke yellow.
Mhm.
But asked, Earl said, well, when I opened up the case, said, the neck, boy, it did look good. But says, when I picked it up out of the case, he says, well, the best thing I could say, I was just sick. But said he was such a good man, and said, you know, I didn't have the heart to say anything.
Yes.
But people like Jim Faulkner, of course, also at that time, Ed Selfinger and what's his name, Red Roberts, had started traveling from Bucks County, traveling around selling the individual parts and pieces of these things.
Right.
Bob Flesher and Paul Morrissey with Liberty Banjo, they were there in 1970. Of course, also in 1970, Gibson had a stand, and they had changed their model from the bow tie model to the other model. So there was a lot of things going on.
Things
and,
were changing.
Yeah, and you know it was different. You know, the bow tie 250, the one-piece flange moved into a two-piece flange with a different inlay pattern. But it's like at that point in time, there were so many people who wanted banjos that looked like Earl Scruggs or Don Reno. Gibson, you know, their endorsing artists were basically Roy Clark and Wayne Newton. They were selling
Yeah, that's
whatever.
where the mainstream instrument sales were.
They were
name recognition for most people.
They were totally oblivious to this whole bluegrass thing that was starting. And so getting a few parts and pieces, of course, Buddy Clarence Hall, he's got a picture of me in 1968, I think it is, at the Galax Fiddlers Convention with the first Gibson flange I ever got. A fellow named John Odom from down in Blountville, Tennessee, he had Gibson, all sorts of different parts and stuff, and they were basically second stuff that had come through Dave Kennedy,
right.
who used to work at Kalamazoo. He also sold a lot of stuff to Roger Smith over in Indiana,
right.
a lot of stuff to Adolph Eisel over in Columbus.
Right.
But it was stuff that you couldn't normally get a hold of. But I was interested in kind of figuring out how to do these things. Went to the Fiddlers Convention at Hillsville in about '69, and Wayne Henderson had a guitar he'd built like a D45 Martin. And I got to talking to him, and he was the first one that ever gave me a pack of, it was a Friday night, and then it was going to be a Saturday night, and he actually gave me a pack of jeweler saw blades. Didn't do me any good because I didn't have a jeweler saw. I thought they would fit in a coping saw, but there was nothing to hook on the ends of it there. So then I had to figure out, we'll get you, you can call, right, and of course back in them days you didn't call nobody.
Right.
Wrote Davis Jeweler Supply in Roanoke.
So you're learning, if you would, on the fly about some of the mechanics of doing this. And then as you became a resource person to Gibson, okay, in the early to mid 80s, then the evolution of that, your involvement with those Earl Scruggs models. Now, when did you start, or when did you and Gibson start to separate away from each other, and they were no longer looking to you for some
first
input?
time I ever walked through the doors of Gibson was one of the initial meetings of the IBMA in '85. I asked somebody where Gibson was at, and they pointed, go down on Massman down here. And of course, I didn't know where that was at. Never been to Nashville that many times, other than when I worked there with Monroe. But I mean, back in them days, you didn't have a car. I stayed in the motel, and when the bus pulled out, bus was right across the road from the motel, and I didn't venture out a lot. But anyway, I found Gibson, went down and asked if they did tours, and the lady said, well, no, not really. And I told her, well, I'm just kind of interested in banjos and things. Of course, see, Wayne had helped me get a jeweler saw and jeweler saw blades, but there's no place to buy a mother of pearl. But they used to get these great old big buttons on coats, and there was a rag shop not far from home, had everything you could imagine with that. So I'd get the buttons, sand them flat, and would cut them out. But then we went down and they said, you know, they found out I was a little interested in banjos, and they said, well, we got to hang on a minute. So she went back, this tall, sandy-headed guy come out, and it turned out to be Nick Kimmons.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, we normally don't do tours or anything, but I said, maybe I can do you 10 or 15 minutes. So we walked through and walked our way to the back where the wood comes in, and we walked up through there, and the little cubicle where he assembled banjos. Of course, that time they was only doing the Earl Scruggs model and the RB250. He maybe had a half a dozen necks and pots sitting around there. But the thing that opened up the door was he said, well, you know a little bit about banjos. Tell me what you think of this pot. He handed me a RB250 pot, and all the nuts were on bottom upwards. And I said, well, I mean, it looks good except the nuts are on backwards. He said, well, some told me one way and some told me the other. Nick didn't know anything about banjos. When they moved from Kalamazoo down there, banjos were kind of like a red-headed stepchild.
Always has been.
The custom people didn't want them. They finally put them with the carved instruments.
Right.
They didn't want to fool with them.
Right.
Nick kind of took it on as his baby. And, you know, I mean, he ended up assembling probably 15, 20,000 banjos
Right.
over his
Right.
time there.
Now, Doug, as time moved forward and you became a school teacher, yes, in Virginia.
Well, see, I had taught originally in 1974 in Kentucky for a while.
Okay.
And then went to work for a college for about 10 years. And that's where I left out of when I went to Gibson there.
Okay.
First meeting was there in '85, and Nick told me about the dumpster out back.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went back there, and I mean, gosh, there was F5 bodies cut up, and there was, you know, Earl Scruggs peg heads sliced across the side, and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, like, I go in and pitch it out of the dumpster and pitch it in the back of the car and take off. But then, you know, in '86, they did what Charlie Darrington and I think Curtis McPeak kind of was adding a little bit. They were going to reintroduce the Granada.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it happened to be at the IBMA, the first trade show. It had it in a tent down on the river there. And I had started a radio show the second week in July that year. And I think it was toward the end of August when they did it that year. But anyway, went up and I kind of saw this thing sitting over there. And it didn't look like a Granada. I had Harry Sparks, my guru in most of this stuff, had given me old inlay patterns, and I knew what the old inlays looked like.
Yeah.
That was not an old inlay pattern. The engraving wasn't hand done; it was pantographed. The way Monty Moore did, you know, all the stuff for Gibson, and it was. I mean, it had the big clumsy clamshell tailpiece from this late '60s and early '70s. And it just, you know.
So you were working to help recorrect more to period
the
way that you knew.
At that point, I mean,
Right.
they had only done one.
Right.
And Charlie Darrington said, here, take it, just try it out. I said, I don't even want to touch it.
Right.
I don't want to have anything to do with it. He turned it all around, and it looked like the old RB800 Sunburst.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't cherry red,
Right.
but it was almost a Granada color. But
Right.
I mean, it just looked like well, Sonny Osborne ran him out of the back of the Opry one time and said, get that toy away from me.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know about that till way afterwards.
Right.
But as it turned out, I worked it through Charlie to interview Henry for my radio show a few weeks later. Went down, sat down, and talked, and he said, well, what do you think about a new Granada? And I said, well, and I realized I was talking to the owner of the company. Of course, they'd only had it a few years then. I was trying to get a lot of the bugs worked out of it. And I said, well, and from where it came, I don't know. It's like Grady Nutt used to talk about. It just came to me.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, do you want to know what I really think, or do you want to know or do you want me to say what you want to hear? He said, well, I'd like to know what you really think. And I said, well, if you put it out the way the one that was in Owensboro, you're going to get laughed out of the marketplace. And he said, oh, well, tell me more. I said, well, you're dealing with the most educated group of banjo buyers that the world have ever known. They have literally created their own cottage industry of building instruments that looks like old Gibsons because Gibson won't do it. And I mean, he was taking all this in, didn't get defensive, didn't get upset or anything. And he said, well, tell me more. And I said, well, is it available? He got on the phone. Within 3 or 4 minutes, it was up there. We laid it down there, and we started at one end and went to the other. And I said, now, don't take my word for it. Get some other people who have worked on old instruments. And, you know, please don't put something out like this.
Right.
I mean, you know, the new and improved is not wanted. People want what you did back in the 20s and 30s. And he made a statement that day that he stood by. He says, if it's not right, it won't go out of here. They had 50 sets of metal hardware already engraved and gold plated. They scrapped 49 sets. Henry Juskowitz made
Now,
a
this
believe
was
in me.
1985, more or less?
This was 86.
86.
Yep.
Do you remember at Bean Blossom when we were there the first time, either in 70 or the next year of 71, because I was there both those years, that Gibson was owned by Norland at that time,
Yep.
and they were sending representatives around with tape recorders, sticking a mic in people's faces, saying, what do you want Gibson to do?
Yep.
What do you want us to offer you?
Yep.
And, you know, unanimously, the pickers all said, we want the 20s and the 30s
The reason for
back.
this interview is that I want to know about Doug Hutchens, okay, and how your life has unfolded, okay? Gibson was part of that. Then we also had the Bill Monroe involvement. You've been a wonderful representative for Bill Monroe, the Bluegrass Boys, and the things that you've done in terms of rewards to the Bluegrass Boys that were members. I know as I was helping Roger Smith's wife, okay, and the great things that you've done for many of the Bluegrass Boys. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved in the, if you would, remembering Bluegrass Boys and some of the things that you've graciously done for that group of people out
All
there.
this came about through, you know, the banjo and the involvement. When I was working for Gibson, you know, I was, first of all, we changed a lot of things around, tried to get things more in tune the way they were years ago. But I guess one of the first things was I went to Henry and I said, we need some bluegrass collectibles. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you've got all these country and rock and roll posters. We don't have a single bluegrass poster. He said, who would you do? I said, well, Bill Monroe for one, and Earl Scruggs. And he just said, get you a photographer, do it. I mean, Henry could make a decision and just do it.
Right.
You know, he didn't want all the details, all this kind of stuff. Said, write it up.
So that was the starting point as you started to evolve the recognition for the Bluegrass Boys.
No, we'd actually started that before. Bill in 1980, 81, 82, he had some pretty bad health problems. And I guess it was 81. He, on Kenny Baker's birthday, the 26th of June, down a little place called Jellicoe Creek on the Kentucky and Tennessee line, Paul Mullins came over and Bill asked Paul, says, have you got an old fiddle that's about ready to fall apart or something? And Paul says, I got one hanging out in the barn, it's got a hornet's nest in it. He says, that's what we want. Said, get it and get it wrapped up. Said, we'll give it to Kenny for his birthday on stage. And so Bill had such he had just a time of fun getting that thing set up, getting it wrapped up. Had this large lady come out and present this thing to Kenny. I mean, he come out in a big box and everything. He tears into it and everything. And Baker looks up at it very diplomatic. Well, I think it needs maybe a few strings, maybe 4 of them. And, they go through that. And then Bill gives Kenny a birthday card and another little box. He gives him some gold cufflinks and give him a $100 bill in his birthday card.
Right.
And I decided we need to do something for this man's birthday. That was along in the 26th of June. I came home and got to thinking, well, what do we do? And so that's where the mandolin case came from. I knew that John Paganoni had made not only the mandolin, but the case for Doyle Lawson. And it was a lower style case. And it always bothered me that Bill carried that case around that Tut Taylor had done for him with his name upside down on it. And about that time, that case had, some say it got damaged, others say it hadn't, but he had given it to a lady in Florida and was using a regular mandolin-shaped case. And I thought, well, that just don't look right with Bill Monroe walking around with a case look like that. It's not dignified, you know. So I got in touch with John Paganoni and called my old buddy Harry Sparks again. I said, who can do superb leather work? And told him my idea to get a case made and then have Bill's name on it. He said, hey, Nick Boone to Leatherhead in Louisville, he makes saddles. He can do whatever you want. So I get Paganoni and John together. I mean, here it is June already. And, you know, give it to him on, I think, the 9th or 10th of September that year. But I get them two together. Paganoni builds a carcass, sends it to Louisville. First I thought, well, let's really play it up and let me buy it a seat where they take it, Paganoni take it to the airport in Dulles, fly it to Louisville, and then fly it back from Louisville to up there. It's going to cost too much. And so it ended up, they shipped it UPS, but Paganoni built the carcass, sent it to Nick. He did the leather work, sent it back to Paganoni. He put the inside in. Here, I get it. And so we present that to Bill along with a hat, and we fixed up a big birthday card. Had sent out sheets. I forget what it was, something on it. I had some Bill Monroe stationery that I picked up at Bean Blossom. It had Bill Monroe written in rope, and made some copies of that, sent it to all the Bluegrass boys that I could find. I'd been doing a thing since the late 70s trying to find all the people that worked with him. So we get, I don't know, 30, 40, or maybe it was 80 the first year.
Names.
Names, or basically birthday wishes back.
Mm-hmm.
So we make this big, I take a Martin guitar back that I got from the factory, cut it out, and make this big birthday card where you open it up, and it's got all these pages from the guys. Got in touch with the people down at Kentucky Fried Chicken, Miss Clara Lampkin and the folks, and they said, hey, sure, come on down. And of course, that's on YouTube now, mm-hmm. where you see, you know, I think his 81st birthday.
Right.
But they fixed it up where, you know, we did the presentation to it. Tex Logan, Cleo Davis, Gordon Terry, Red Taylor, all came. Byron Berline was already there. You know, we did the presentation on stage there on the Belvedere with all these people there. And so the next year, you know, we thought, well, let's do something else. So we actually had Nick to make him a saddle. He had surgery and all, and when he was riding, his old saddle hurt his legs. And so we got to checking around and had Nick build him a saddle for the next year. The third year, we had it over at Mason's Restaurant there in Nashville. But each year we would do something for his birthday and try to include as many former band members as we could in on that. And of course, probably the worst part of any of that is when his mandolins got beat up in '86, I guess it was. Mm-hmm. The fireplace poker that we had given him in '85, we gave him a fireplace set, and a fellow made it out of wrought iron down in North Carolina, and that's what was used to beat up his mandolins. Yeah. But then, you know, we did on up to '87. '86, we did it in Owensboro, and we gave him a mantle clock and I forget 2 or 3 different things. And somebody, as I come off the stage, that was when the IBMA was down there, and it was a couple of weeks after his, or maybe it was right before his birthday then. But anyway, when I come off stage, somebody says, well, what are you going to do to top this next year? And again, from where it came from, I don't know. I said, we're going to do it live on Nashville Now. didn't know what we were going to do, but I just didn't want somebody saying, "Well, what are you going to do now?"
Mhm.
And well, I got home, called Tony Conway, he's the guy that did the booking. I said, "Oh, can you make sure that Bill's on Nashville Now?" I already checked his birthday was going to be on Sunday or Monday. I said, "Well, we can get him on there on Friday night. I'll hold that date clear." So then I got to thinking, it'd be neat. Well, Mr. Grant Turner had told me about belt buckles that Ernest Tubb had made. And after you had traveled a certain number of miles or a certain length of time, you got a buckle. They called it the Fraternity of Troubadours.
Mhm.
And I thought, well, it'd be kind of neat to have a belt buckle. So there happened to be a guy, I was working at Dallas Lloyd College at the same time, who was really into music and NASCAR and things like that. And I had seen some of these trophy buckles that the rodeo people do. Happened to be in Dallas, and of all things, there was a belt buckle convention. Went out there, and I never realized there was as many beautiful buckles as there were. So I took, and I don't know why. Again, it came from where I not know. But the first 3 years, I'd hired a professional photographer to take pictures at the birthday celebrations. And there was one particular stoic picture of Bill, and I thought, that's what I want to build it all around. So Fred Huffman was a guy, he drew out about 10 different sketches and to start with, and then he ended up with another 5 or 6 before I said, that's what we want to do. I asked Gibson Guitars, I asked Martin, I asked MCA Records, I asked the Grand Ole Opry, I asked at that time, I guess it was Pickin' Magazine, Pickin' or whatever it was right after that, or maybe before that, whatever it was in 81, and then the Grand Ole Opry. Mike Longworth called and said, "Doug," said, "I'd love to be a part of this, but Chris Martin will never put any money out on something with a Gibson mantle on it."
Mhm.
I said, "Well, no thanks, but no thanks, Roger Semenoff called me and said, would be love to be part of this, but says, we'll need to have control of it. And I said, well, I've been doing it a while, thank you, but no thank you. They had been doing those awards on the Nashville network, and so he wanted to be able to kind of front it.
Right.
And it's not that I needed to front anything, but I just didn't want unfair stuff going on that it really didn't mean anything to Bill. But Emory Gordy Jr. called and said MCA had a policy that they didn't put out any money unless it was directly related to a release. And then who's the other? Oh, Gibson. Charlie Darrington was still a little miffed at me about shooting his Granada project in the head, and he didn't pass the information on to Henry. So it ended up, Pete Kuykendall called, said, yes, I want to be a part of it. Mr. Bud Wendell called, says, where do I send the check? I'd asked for $1,500 a piece from each one of them. The project was going to cost about $800 or $8,500. And as it was, I had $3,000 to do the project. We was going to do 500 buckles.
Mm-hmm.
But as it ended up, I got $3,000, and I went ahead and we used award design metals out in Noble, Oklahoma, which makes superb belt buckles. And rather than doing 500, we cut it back to 250, and I was still short on money, so I had a top tension number 7, and I left it with Curtis McPeak, and he sold it. And that's what paid for the rest of the belt buckles.
Wow.
And matter of fact, here at Banjothon 3 years ago, that banjo was here and for sale for $75,000.
Yeah.
So buckles cost me a little bit, but anyway, we
buckles with a history.
We got the first. I already had ordered them before I got all the well, I'd ordered 500, and they weren't going to be poured for. They were still doing their artwork. But I'd already decided I wanted 6 solid silver buckles, 6 of the gold silver plated buckles, and then the brass buckle, because each of the ones where had give $1,500, I was going to give them a set of the buckles on mounted.
Doug, what we're going to do, because there's a lot of energy being expended here, take us up through your involvement, up through Bill Monroes passing. Then we're going to come back tomorrow evening
Okay.
and we're going to re-engage the conversation.
Okay.
Because, you know, time flies,
It does.
okay?
It does.
And there's a lot of energy that you've given, and we're capturing pieces and bits of information here that is irreplaceable. But what I want to do is say that we can pick up from the death of Bill Monroe.
Okay.
And then I want to focus on the rest of your life, okay? What you've been doing in the last 25 or 30 years of your life, your involvement, you know, back at the homestead, the things that you're still involved with in banjo, why you come to Banjothon and why you enjoy it. And I don't want to be short about this.
Right.
So what we want to do is take us through Bill Monroe's passing.
Okay.
Then I'm going to give you a rest, okay? And then we're going to come back
Okay.
and finish the conversation and the story, and that'll give you time to
Okay.
recollect on
Sure.
the last 30 years.
I got a call about 5 o'clock in the afternoon when Bill passed away, and my buddy Tony Testament, and he said, hadn't heard, but with his tone of voice, I knew. And he said, well, he passed this afternoon. So I picked up the phone and called Tony Conway and said, you know, he had passed that afternoon. He kind of filled me in on what the preliminary plans were. I went on to school the next morning and I had a little sixth grade
You were
girl.
teaching?
Yeah, I was,
Sixth grade.
I was teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th grade.
Right.
And evidently I looked pretty worried because a little 6th grade girl came in and said, Mr. Hutchens, is something wrong? I said, well, you know, I had a real good friend that passed away yesterday. And of course, I hadn't been there that long. I didn't have that many vacation days built up and all. I said, you know, I'm trying to figure out if I can go to the funeral. And she looked up at me and said, this is the only time he's ever going to die.
From the mouth of a sixth grader. Yeah.
So I made my plans. I went.
Yeah.
Eddie Stubbs played Bill Monroe music
Yes.
from the time that Bill passed until after the services at the Ryman. That night, I pulled into a motel over here just past Knoxville. And as Eddie was playing Bill's last performance on the 15th of March that year on the Opry. And, you know, I went ahead and went on and went to sleep then. Got up the next morning, went on into Nashville, and they was giving the traffic reporter, I think it was Richard Thomas, Flight 650 or Flight 65, or whatever it was telling about the funeral procession, leaving the funeral home and coming to the Ryman. And I pulled into the Ryman and parked, and you know, they had changed it around so much in the few years before that, I didn't know where in the world you went in. They had the side doors open and where they'd just taken the casket in. I didn't know that. But I walked into what used to be the parking lot there, walked right in and looked, and, you know, here they was opening the casket down there. And I walked in, stood there a minute, and started to turn around and go back out. And Tony Conway hollered at me and said, Doug, come on down here. And James was there, and he says, you need to be down here with us today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
And there's a lot has been said, you know, by a lot of people about Bill Monroe. And I think the unique part of your relationship with Bill Monroe is being expressed right now. You know, that many years later, but your commitment to bluegrass music, to Gibson banjos, okay, and to Bill Monroe and the music in general is still manifesting itself with the emotions that you have that you can easily let out.
I can't imagine who I would be today had I not spent the time with
Yeah,
him.
absolutely.
He was like, you know, he and Bertha all were like grandparents to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And never go to a show that when I got ready to leave, I'd go around and say, you know, see y'all next time. He'd always kind of motion me over the side. Do you need any money? Is everything all right now? And of course, he'd met Mom and Dad, and, you know, they had talked to him. And I mean, he just...
The
He was
man had an
fun.
impact on all of our lives. You know, we get together, okay, to play banjos and talk, but it's more than that. It's
Oh, yes.
more than banjos. It's about people, it's about relationships, and about impact that other people have had and that we've had on each other's lives.
Yeah.
You know, I have not met Gary Price until I started to come here, okay? But there's a relationship, there's a kindredship that makes this through music.
The neat
And-
thing about these gatherings is Gary and I could be talking about it, and two other people walk up, and we start carrying on another conversation. We meet next year, and we pick up the same
Yeah.
conversation and go from where we left off last
I'd like
year.
to mention one thing about Doug that
Absolutely.
hasn't been brought up yet.
And you should.
There was a period of time when national finger picks were not available. And pre-war nationals were bringing a fancy prize, and a handful of people stepped up to the plate and started making quality finger picks to fill the void, and Doug was one of those.
Absolutely was.
And I have several sets of those picks, and But-
You know, and where I'm gonna stop this, and we're not done, but we're gonna stop this, is that as I started doing these Banjothon interviews and I had the opportunity to present, you know, Gary, you were one of the people that I wanted most, okay, to have this opportunity. Because I know when I was doing those Roger Smith interviews, and then I lost Roger. Roger Bannister and I lost Roger, okay? He was a part of our lives for 50 years. And I lost him because that's the natural part of life.
Yeah.
But the opportunity to sit over here and listen to you and to have you share with us your absolute commitment to music and to Bill Monroe and to the other people is one of the highlights, honestly, Doug, it's one of the highlights of my life.
Well, I appreciate that. It's paying it back
Yeah, sure.
to
Absolutely.
Bill. It's like, you know, James called me in 1999, said he was going to start the festival at Rosine in 2000, and wanted to know if I could get some Bluegrass boys together. It's kind of a reunion there.
Mhm.
And it wasn't going to be a budget in it or anything else. And again, I didn't know why I had all these pictures taken before. But
But you did.
I got
You knew why.
Willard Gayhart. I found that if you surround yourself with good, competent people,
Mhm.
people that are a lot more talented than you are, boy, you come out smelling like a rose.
Yeah.
A lot of people, they want to surround themselves with people that don't know too much.
Mhm.
Well, you look like the leader of a bunch of fools.
Yeah.
But Willard Gayhart was a super artist. I took him that picture, that kind of stoic picture I
Yes.
mentioned of Bill, and I said, I want this, but I want something else in it. Not long after that, John Hartford came up to me and had some pictures of Uncle Pen. Had 6 different pictures that Bill didn't even have years before. And I said, I'd really love to have a copy of these. He said, well, I thought you would. These are yours. So we took Uncle Pen, we created a picture that didn't exist. There was a picture of Uncle Pen sitting, playing the fiddle. His crutches were leaned against the fence. His dog was at his feet, but his hat was down over his face. You couldn't see him. And so Willard, I had the other picture where Uncle Pen was walking. So he took the head off the one where he was walking
Right.
and put it on the one where he was sitting down.
Yeah.
So the first print we did, we called it Late in the Evening.
Mhm.
It has Bill on playing the mandolin, almost like he's looking off, and Uncle Pen sitting over
Right.
on the other side playing the fiddle.
Yeah.
And so that year, what would happen is I could get these prints done pretty economically, and again, doing them myself. Willard worked out a deal with me. If I would pay for the prints, he would take a number of prints for doing the artwork.
Yeah.
Normally, he got a pretty good little chunk of change for that.
I'm going to use that right there.
Okay.
Those pictures
Okay.
that Willard generated, I'm going to use that as a stopping point, and it'll
Okay.
give us the next starting point.
Okay.
Because there's a whole set of stories that are sitting there. We're going to adjourn it, but we're going to come back, okay? And it'll
were
probably
you at
be tomorrow
Rosine
evening.
for the dedication
Thanks.
of Uncle Pen's